Hi, my name is Joe Glombek. I'm a .NET developer at Bump Digital in the UK, and I'm an MVP of the open source CMS Umbraco. You can catch me at my website, joe.gl, or on Twitter at Joe Glombek. So let's start really simple. What is Git? So Git is the most popular source control management system out there today. It can ensure your code is backed up, versioned, but also accessible to other developers. But used properly, it can be so much more. It can help ease complex processes such as release management, feature development, and working with multiple people concurrently. But I can be a bit of a Git about it. I'm really fussy about how we use Git, and that's a good thing. Poor Git utilization is a far more common issue than you'd think with the I've worked with a fair few organizations over the past few years, and it's a more common problem than you might expect. People are kind of using their Git as a dumping ground for code rather than a well-managed archive of software that it could be. So today we're going to look at 5 simple tips which will, with any luck, improve your Git practice. This isn't one of the 5, but there are seriously some organizations out there not using SCM, a source control management system, yet. Source control is not the same as a backup, and if you've ever emailed your code to a colleague and things like that, you're probably doing it wrong. This is what Git should be used for. Why did the developer not want to use Git? Because they were scared of committing to it. Hey. But for all the reasons I gave previously and how Git can be used effectively, SCM is essential for modern day software development. There are other options out there: Mercurial, Team Foundation Version Control, which is a lot more of a mouthful than it used to be in its previous naming convention, and Subversion. They're all examples of source control management systems, but Git has really taken over in the software world and is kind of the industry standard now. I'd recommend it for that on its own. There's no point teaching your team a source control system, which is or may soon become redundant. So let's start moving on to the tips then. Tip number 1, commit messaging is everything. So here's a comic from the brilliant XKCD webcomic. As a project drags on, my Git commit messages get less and less informative. So here we're going from something as descriptive as created main loop and timing control into the absolute anarchy of my hands are typing words. Hands! And I'd like to say that this is just a joke in a comic strip, but it can be all too real. I'm definitely feeling for you here, Dennis. He says, investigating an issue, and by scanning through useful commit messages in Git history. So we've got some beautiful Git messages such as test, test, test. There's some bump commit messages in there. Translation fix, which is better, but still not necessarily enough information in there, followed by some more bumps. So can you imagine being in Dennis's situation and you've discovered a bug, but you can't find the commit where it's likely happened? These commit messages down here that we just talked about don't provide enough information for you even to know where to start looking for when this bug might have been introduced since the last release. Or how about you just see something odd in the code base, there's no comment, so you use a blame or annotate tool to see who changed it and why. You can see up here it's that top test commit that's the culprit, and it's committed by Andy, but Andy's on holiday and the commit message just says test, so it's not at all clear why those changes were made and what the reasoning behind it was. And you're at risk of reintroducing a bug if you change it. Conversely, let's say we've looked at a piece of code that's changed since you last were working on it, but why has that been changed? Maybe you're not quite happy with it, it's not quite in the format you'd expect it to be in. You could just revert it to how it was before, the way you liked it, but what if it was changed for a reason? So you fire up that blame tool again, and you see the commit message now up there says fixes date formatting issue in Chrome. Okay, the way I was doing it actually was faulted, might have looked simpler, but it's not working. It's a bug and it's been fixed. So we better leave it as is. So that in that scenario, we've actually been saved by a good commit message. So some people will tell you that if you want to write a good commit message, it should be written as if answering the question, what does this commit do? And that is great advice. You can also start your commit with a verb. That's another common recommendation, like fixes, reverts, or integrates, and that's great practice as well. But it's not enough on its own. So fixes bugs, reverts broken changes, integrates API, these are still useless. They don't tell us what's happening in those commits. Detail, detail, detail. GitKraken and many other GUI clients give you two fields for your commit messages, a title and a description. It's best to keep your title short. GitKraken recommends 72 characters actually, but then you add more detail in the description field. So let's take a look at a few of these examples. We've changed the examples from the previous slide. Fixes date formatting issue in Chrome. Way better than fixes bugs. And then that's just the title. Then we go into the description. So Chrome always assumes the month-to-month, day-to-day format, no matter what locale the browser is set to. It doesn't do that. This is just a fictional bug that I've made up for this. Chrome is better at handling data than that, don't worry. Okay, and what about our revert commit? Reverts new paytastic checkout flow. That's the title. And the description, customer has changed their mind and wants to revert to using legacy cart. Fantastic. Overview at the top and much more detail in the description. And our integrates API, we've only added a little more detail to the title of this one. Integrates SMS API, but then in the description of that commit, sending an SMS to our customers when their order ships using the simple SMS sender API. That's where all the detail is. In fact, if you're working on the project, integrates SMS API will probably provide more context than it does to us, but it is all there in the detail. Also, your choice of Git client doesn't matter. That's not an excuse. You can do it on the command line by passing in two of those message parameters. So that's the -m parameter. And the first one will be title, and the second one will be the description. If you're using a Git client that doesn't support multiple fields, actually just putting a couple of carriage returns in there, just a couple of line breaks, is all those Git fancy GUI clients are doing under the scenes. So you can do it everywhere, there's no excuse. If you have a ticketing system or a to-do list, it sometimes helps to include the title of your item in your commit and an ID or link to the initial issue. That proves really, really useful. GitKraken and other Git clients let you hook up your issue tracker to your Git repos. So you can automatically stick an issue number into the branch name, and therefore it'll be in the merge commit as well. Here you can see I've got my Git repo in GitKraken hooked up to GitHub issues, selected by repository in there. You can type in the search to find the issue you want to work on, right click on the issue, and create a branch for the issue. So it's all built into GitKraken. It's very easy to add that extra information. That way, when you come back to an issue in the future, or you're looking at a commit and wanting more detail, you can take that linked commit, take that commit and the linked issue ID, go back into GitHub issues and see all the conversation and the various steps that happened around that commit. And that brings us on to tip number 2, and that's to commit and push little and often. I've seen lots of different tactics when it comes to how often people should commit, but the most persuasive argument I've heard for is little and often. Because don't forget, Git acts as a backup of your work in progress as well. There's no point only committing when something is feature complete. What happens if your hard drive packs up overnight, or if you're off sick tomorrow and somebody else is left to pick up your work? It's far more useful to have partially complete work committed than none at all. Although it is good practice to ensure that each commit is in a buildable state if you're writing compiled software, or a working state if you're not. I think it's okay in this scenario of work in progress or WIP commits. It's okay if they don't build or they don't work, as long as they're highlighted as such. With little and often commits, it helps you to revert unwanted pieces of functionality. So while it can be a real pain to pull a small chunk of code out of a bigger commit, it's a lot easier if you just have to revert that one little change. So here is a Git graph of me making this presentation. So I've done my initial commit, written the talk, created the presentation, changed the color scheme to green text on a red background. Then I've reordered the slides, merged the branch into the main branch, and then someone pointed out to me that maybe green text on a red background, not the best color scheme, so I've reverted that. In fact, that's a very small change, and I did it alongside the reorder slides, so I could quite easily have put that into a commit called small changes or something, with both the change color scheme and the reorder slides. But actually, you can see now that unpicking one of those things is really, really easy if they are in those smaller commits. Whereas if it was several changes into one commit, it would have been a lot more difficult to pick those out. But yeah, perhaps green text on a red background was a bit too much. And so let's look at tip number 3. Don't all these little and often commit messages start making a racket after a while? See what I did there? That's where squash and amend come in. So, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of work in progress commits at the end of the day. But tomorrow, I come in, I finish off that small segment of work. I don't want this situation. I don't want 2 commits. I don't want whip, restyle footer, that's what I've prefixed my work in progress branch, work in progress commit, sorry, and restyle footer. I don't want both of those commits. So what I can do is amend my work in progress commit to include all the changes and rename it to restyle footer. So what I'm going to do before committing that restyle footer complete that I don't want, I've only got the whip restyle footer committed, and then I've made the rest of the changes. I'm going to stage those changes in GitKraken, and then you'll notice there's this little amend checkbox in the commit message panel. And what that will do is make it so you're amending or changing that commit you've already made. So in there, it's going to automatically populate the commit message with the one you wrote earlier. So it will initially say whip restyle footer, but actually it's not work in progress anymore. So I'm going to rename that to just restyle footer. As you can see there, I've got all my changes so that all of that feature is now staged, and I hit that amend previous commit button, and we have this Git tree. So we've just got the initial commit and then restyle footer, which is much, much tidier. We've got rid of that whip commit now that we've finished it. So what about if you want to combine multiple commits, or you've already committed your second round of changes? Well, we can then look at squashing those changes. So here in my example, going through with GitKraken again, I've actually done 2 rounds of whip of the work in progress of the restyle footer. Perhaps I've been pulled off onto other projects today. And then I've completed that footer, and actually I've moved on and done some other commits, restyle header. But now actually I should really tidy up my branch. I've realized I've forgotten to do my amends. I need to tidy this up. So that's where squash comes in. So here is this repo in GitKraken. What I'm doing is multiple selecting the commits that I want to combine, right clicking and saying squash these 3 commits. And that makes my tree look like this. So I've got my initial commit, then I've got restyle footer, and then I've got my restyle header. So it's possible with squash to to amend history that's already passed, as it were. There are some scenarios where you won't see that squash command available, or a squash will fail. In those scenarios, maybe there's a more complicated Git history going on, there's more complicated changes happening that may not be immediately visible to you. In these scenarios, I'd say just leave it. Leave it as it is on the left here, where we've got those two work in progress commits. It's not as pretty, but there's no point trying to fight against the system and potentially mess it up. So let's just leave it as is in those scenarios. But if it's available, you should be good to go. So an analogy for this is I'm doing some DIY at home. Things get pretty messy with tools and dirt around the place. But before I go to bed, I'll probably do a quick tidy up. But the next day, so it's a 2-day job, once I've finished that piece of DIY, that piece of work, all my tools go away, vacuum up the mess I've made. I'll definitely have it clean and tidy before I let anyone else in the house. And you should treat your branches in the same way, right? It's okay for them to be messy while you've got things in progress, but as soon as you're finished or ready to merge into a shared branch, you ought to tidy it up. Nobody wants to see that messy branch. And one thing to note, though, is don't squash your mistakes. Your mistakes and your reworkings, they tell a story. They're important. They can provide a valuable explanation to a future developer, but it also documents your mistakes and your learnings. We should be proud of these because that's us developing as developers. So don't hide those. Use amend and squash to tidy things up, not to sweep things under the rug. All right then, let's take a look at tip number 4, and that is to use a branching strategy. So there are many branching strategies out there, and to be honest, I don't really mind which one you use. My personal favourites are GitHub Flow and Common Flow, or more often than not a combination of those two, but there are many, many more. And there's a link just here down to a GitKraken tutorial on working with some of these flows and branch strategies in GitKraken, and it goes into a bit more detail over all of them. But in summary, generally these sort of follow a feature-driven development pattern. So you create a branch for each feature you're working on, and then there's some notion of a state of a particular release. So generally a branch or a tag that tells you what was deployed at what point. I also like to ensure that only one person is committing to any single branch at one time. So if you've got 2 people working on a feature, you might be better off breaking that feature down into sub-features and then have 2 different feature branches. This allows us to do that sort of work in progress and that messy branch tactic that I was talking about before. You really need to have your own branch for that approach to work if you're rewriting history. But let's go into a bit of detail on GitHub Flow. Put very simply, it involves creating a branch for your feature, and that's mapped to a GitHub issue. You add your commits to that branch, and then you open a pull request. You discuss and review your code change with your colleagues. You might add more code changes, more commits. You might tweak things a little bit. But then once that pull request process is over, you deploy those changes for testing. Once the testing is complete and everyone's happy, your pull request is then merged into the main branch. The GitHub Flow tutorial down here goes into a bit more detail. It's a nice interactive graph there for you if you're interested. GitHub Flow is a little bit of an odd one in that they don't have a sort of a state of something being tested. It's you deploy a particular branch for test, but it's quite a nice methodology. If that doesn't work for you, though, it's worth noting that none of these Git flows or branch strategies might make sense to you, but you can take inspiration from them. I don't actually know of any companies who strictly follow one particular strategy. So pick one as your baseline and then adapt it to your organization, to your needs, to your project. but definitely have a branch strategy, and using one of these will mean it's more familiar to someone who you employ in the future. So I've got one final tip to keep these Git repos nice and tidy, and that's to use Rebase and merge. So you've got your branching strategy and you've completed your feature and we're ready to merge. But on larger projects with multiple concurrent workflows, you can end up with a bit of a tangle of branches and merges, a bit like you can see here. This is actually a fairly tame example of what you can get, but you can see all the branches are sort of interlinked with each other and moving around. It's quite hard to follow what's happened here. So what are our other options for performing these merges? GitHub provides these three options when you complete a pull request. Create a merge commit, which creates the mess we just saw. Squash and merge, and then rebase and merge. So let's take a look at squash and merge, or squash and rebase. So some people really like this. Your entire feature gets squashed into one commit and then plopped straight onto the main or develop branch. It's very neat and tidy, I'll give you that. But you lose a lot of the documentation of when, how, and why code changes were made. I'd much rather keep this history if possible. So the fact that we've got just a Git talk, we've lost all that detail of those changes that were made and the revisions it went through to get to the state that we're in now. And it makes reverting changes very difficult. And it's harder to see why something might have happened. So if I changed, say I have some styles for all my presentations and I tweaked one in the Git talk commit, but you don't know why I made that change to those global styles. Can I revert it? Is it safe to change back, etc.? That leaves us with the rebase and merge option. This one allows us to avoid losing data while keeping the tree clean and tidy. So of course, it's my favorite. If you're using Azure DevOps, by the way, you can set this method as a merge type as well, but they don't call it rebase and merge, they call it semi-linear merge. It's the same thing though. So rebasing is the act of replaying a commit in a branch, so that's our feature branch, on top of a target branch, which will be main or develop. And it's as if they were happening at this new point in time. So as you can see from these diagrams here, this method removes the muddle of crisscrossing merges, but all the commits are still there. We're not losing the structure within a branch, and we're not losing any detail. But each of these features now makes a nice, neat D shape against the main or develop branch, and there's no crossovers of those branches like we see here with the right-hand grey branch just cuts across all those other branches. You can also enact this process without a pull request. You can utilize the individual tools of Rebase. So you rebase your feature onto main, and then you use merge to merge your feature into main. And you can do that, of course, in any Git client of your choosing. GitKraken does it well. And that's it. That's our stunning archive of software. We've source controlled with small incremental commits, each having a meaningful and detailed commit message, and they're sat comfortably in feature branches with no distracting noise or complicated merges. The Git tree reads easily from bottom to top, and there's no details hidden, no mistakes masked. It's all there to see. But now a quick note on rewriting history. So both tips 4 and 5 do something controversial in the Git world. That is rewriting history. Not rewriting history as in the act of whitewashing historical atrocity, but simply changing what's been pushed to the Git repository, aka history, after it's happened. That's the rewriting part. So squashing, amending, rebasing, and patching, they're all examples of Git history being rewritten. And I've actively been advocating for 3 of those. So let me explain why. Maintaining your true history over here, that certainly has its merits. It can be useful for learning and for code reviews, but also impossible to mess up your history if you're never tampering with it. However, the way I see it is that this shouldn't come at the cost of the readability of your repo. I prefer to maintain what I like to call my feature history, where the order of our feature development is true, even if we're tweaking the timelines a little of when each feature was developed relative to another feature. I don't advocate for complete rewriting, just this quick tidy up process that we've been talking about. I did mention a risk though there, didn't I? I did say that there was a risk in rewriting history. The key here though is to make sure you've pushed your repository before you start messing with history, so you've got that backup on an external server, and then double check before you push. In fact, your pushes will have to be force pushes because you're changing history, so there is an extra logical step there. GitKraken will pop up with a little pop-up saying, are you sure you really want to do this? So in practice, although it's possible to mess up your history, in practice, it doesn't really happen that often. But thank you very much for listening, and do feel free to get in touch with me with any comments or questions. You can find me at joe.gl on Twitter at Joe Glombek, or on Polywork with the username Glombek. If you're interested in this subject area, I highly recommend subscribing to Scrift magazine at scrift.io, where I'll be publishing an accompanying article in the October issue, I believe. And you can also find more information and all the links that I've provided on the slides at the short link go.joe.gl/git-about-it. You'll find all the details there as well. Thank you very much.